Japan is over 95% Yamato people, with the other 5% being every other ethnicity under the sun, including other native Japanese ethnicities. Literally how? Only several other countries have similar levels of ethnic homogeneity. Well, let's explain this phenomenon with some 6-minute history. So, Japan. Rich in one of the world's most interesting cultures, history, and other things that people are obsessed with. The geography of its cities are something out of a TV show, and the nation really is from a different dimension. It's also a nation that isn't very content with taking historical accountability, but who is, am I right? Anyways, just for clarity, tourists and people studying abroad are not counted towards the population. But even then, this is a very unique statistic. Modern-day Japan obviously allows immigration. I didn't look into what that policy is, but the historical reason behind this demographic starts all the way back at the genesis of human civilization. Fundamentally, Japan is 95% Japanese because Japan is an island, and more or less an island in the middle of nowhere. For one thing, you can't just walk to Japan, so whatever ethnicities were there before the ice bridge melted were there for thousands of years until the first foreigners would arrive by naval fleets. These first people were the Yomon and the Yayoi. Over time, they would merge into what we know as modern-day Japanese people. Japan would live through its ancient, classical, and medieval eras with consistent demographics. That is until the 1500s where a change would arise. The start of the Sengoku era, where multiple warlords known as daimyos staked out territory across the islands of Japan. But one day, the most respected daimyo, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, convinced the warlords to unite, for the sake of expanding the Japanese peoples overseas. The prospect of conquering the Korean peninsula had long been in the agenda of Japanese emperors and shoguns, but now someone actually took the initiative. So the daimyos came together and the combined armies of all but one took their fleets to Korea. The war was meant to be an easy victory for Japan, and rightfully so, having outnumbered and outskilled the Koreans. However, the historical hero of Korean history, Admiral Yi, single-handedly kept several waves of Japanese at bay. Eventually, the Japanese would prevail, but not quickly enough before they would anger East Asia's colossus, China. And this wasn't a divided and technologically inferior rabble like the dynamic in the Second World War. This was a stable and militaristic Ming dynasty, ruled by the once esteemed Wanli Emperor. Despite the fact that the Ming was on political decline around this time, the army was unrivaled. So unsurprisingly, they would march straight into Korea and liberate it from the Japanese invaders. Most daimyos were killed in the war, and back in Japan, the survivors lost their lands to rebellion over this humiliating failure. However, the one daimyo that had remained behind was heralded as a wise leader with great foresight. That was Tokugawa Ieyasu, and with no competition back on the home islands, he united Japan and created the shogunate in 1603. And he was not a big fan of the foreigners, who had first arrived in the 1500s. It was under his regime where the prosecution of foreigners would begin. In the 1630s, Iemitsu, his grandson, would perform his forefather's will and rid Japan of all outsiders. All across Japan, Christian missionaries and traveling merchants were massacred, people were burned at the stake, publicly beheaded, and the survivors were tortured. In Tokyo alone, over 2,000 Christians were killed. Japan would become isolationist and alone. This position was safe for some 100 years, but before long Japan would have to take another look at their neighbor, China, the same nation that had humbled them in the Imjin War, which was now under a new, bigger, and more powerful dynasty. That nation had just entered a conflict with the British. The Japanese had long envied the sheer resource and military size of China. The Japanese had long envied the sheer resource and military size of China, so you can imagine how they were scared when the Chinese were destroyed and very publicly shoved under the Westerners' thumb. In addition, American Commodore Matthew Perry had just docked 4 ships right at Tokyo, demanding free trade and political fealty. Contrary to the samurai mantra, the Japanese acknowledged the pure superiority of the Westerners and conceded. However, in alignment with the samurai mantra, Japan would not disappear quietly into the night. The shogunate, stubbornly trying to stay in the past, lost traction with the people, and the last of the samurai were killed. However, the new people in charge would not abandon this legacy and lineage. The samurai who made the last stand against modernization were heralded as legends, so Japan retained its warrior spirit. In the new government, they would bring back the glory of an emperor, and adopted a couple catchy slogans. The new ruler, Emperor Mutsuhito, or Meiji, would reopen Japan. However, this movement would not be two-way. Many Japanese students moved out to study technological innovations abroad, but in terms of immigration to Japan, the government was selective for scientists and innovators, keeping out other foreigners. Before long, the country would close its borders once again. World War II went down, I'm sure we all know what happened, and now, in modern-day Japan, we see a demographic explained by history.